Tonight, we take you to a tiny American island, a gem, where the beaches are gorgeous, the palm trees sway, but an outrage against common decency and American values is going on in the shadow of the American flag. A 2020 investigation has uncovered an explosive story behind the trusted label, Made in the USA.
How could this happen on American soil? Workers locked in squalid dorms. Some cheated out of their meager salaries, women forced to choose between abortion and their jobs. ABC's chief investigative correspondent Brian Ross exposes a business deal designed for profit. Should it be labeled un-American?
From the world of high fashion down to T-shirts and jeans, Ralph Lauren and the polo company he founded have made a lot of money, setting an American standard for good taste and smart business.
Hi, I want to go to the office.
But there's a little-known part of Ralph Lauren's company's business, 15 time zones away from the fashion runways of New York.
Can I have a look?
Yeah, of course.
Clothing manufactured on an island in the middle of the Pacific called Saipan, in factories, as we saw with our hidden cameras, jammed full of low-cost workers brought in from China, putting in 14-hour days under often miserable conditions, making clothes under contract for the American market.
Polo Sports, Polo, P-O-L-O.
And it's not just Polo. The Gap, the Disney Company, parent of ABC, Jones New York, Liz Claiborne, and many others all have had some of their clothing lines made by manufacturers on Saipan 2, a place where authorities say many factories have cheated thousands of workers out of their pay and their rights.
They're locked in politically, economically, and in some cases physically.
And as we found in a 2020 investigation on Saipan, when the long day of making T-shirts for America ends, workers are kept in crowded, often rat-infested labor barracks. Of course, some are better than others.
Yeah.
But at this one, the toilets didn't work, the showers barely worked, and the water was contaminated.
We've seen some very bad conditions.
Made all the more shameful by the fact that the island of Saipan is not some foreign sweatshop haven. The site of a famous battle during World War II.
Saipan cost 15,000 American casualties.
Saipan has been a territory, a commonwealth of the United States of America since 1976, a place where the American flag goes up every morning.
Sometimes you have to ask yourself what's going on out there. There are things going on that really shouldn't be going on American soil.
Even though most of the factories here are foreign-owned, using Chinese fabric and Chinese workers, the clothing made here can legally be labeled as Made in the U.S.A., a label that was supposed to help protect the jobs of American garment workers.
It's outrageous. It's a total distortion of what the label was meant to indicate to the buyer.
Alan Stamen, the official at the Department of the Interior in Washington, who oversees Saipan and other U.S. territories, says it's a huge scam that the Clinton administration is now trying to stop.
This is huge growth, an $800 million a year business, employing over 15,000 people, and in fact putting probably 15,000 Americans out of work.
Some retailers, including Polo and the Gap, have dropped or modified the Made in the USA label. But at this Hong Kong Chinese-owned factory at 2 in the morning, we saw Made in the USA labels going on Calvin Klein T-shirts headed for American stores this spring. Across the room, Chinese workers were putting Made in the USA labels on sports shirts with the Fila logo.
The retail list reads like a who's who of major U.S. retailers. Just about everybody I've ever heard of is buying product through there.
And they can legally say Made in the USA.
That's correct.
And it's all made possible because of the original agreement between Saipan and the U.S., permitting Saipan to set its own immigration policies. There are now far more foreign contract workers here than U.S. citizens, most from mainland China. Young women who can be seen being trucked around the island, women who have been told by recruiters in China they're going to good jobs in America, but who authorities say essentially have become indentured servants, a practice outlawed in America at the same time as slavery.
I've seen people locked in barracks, locked behind barbed wire.
So American law really stops at the barbed wire gates of these factories?
In many instances, it does.
Eric Gregoire, a a Catholic Church human rights worker from New Jersey, who's also been a consultant for the Interior Department, is one of the few outsiders to have penetrated the closed world of the Saipan garment factories.
I don't think they like outsiders being around, especially outsiders like me, who might inform people of what their rights are.
It is a world in which Gregoire says the women have to pay government officials in China fees of as much as $6,000 or $7,000 to even get jobs on Saipan, putting them deep in debt and beholden to both factory bosses and the officials back in China.
It's a perfect system. If you're one of the people who are getting your clothing from here, you're getting it very cheap. You're getting it from a workforce who really is going to toe the line.
In fact, American authorities have discovered many Chinese workers are forced to sign secret agreements known as shadow contracts before they leave China, severely and in some ways illegally restricting their activities while on American soil. For example, in this agreement, translated into English by American authorities, workers are forbidden to participate in any religious or political activity, or to ask for a salary increase, or even to fall in love or get married, much as might be the case in mainland China.
To allow them to bring that onto U.S. soil is a very deep concern. We've now documented the fact that management coerces female workers who become pregnant into having abortions.
Several of the cases the government says it's documented were at this factory, the one with the contract to make Ralph Lauren polo T-shirts.
T-shirt.
This Chinese woman, Tu Xiao Mei, made T-shirts and pants at the factory until she became pregnant.
When I told them I was pregnant, they told me to have an abortion.
Tu Xiao Mei says she refused to have the abortion and has now been barred from entering the factory. And you're going to have your baby?
那么你打算是想要你的孩子吗？是的 Yes.
Will you get your job back then?
你还能要回你的工作吗？不能 Cannot.
Cannot get her job back, she says. We want to ask you about the abortions. Do you know about the complaint? No. The bosses at the factory said they didn't want to talk about what they called ridiculous allegations. But human rights workers say it's common practice at this factory and others.
With 11,000 Chinese workers here, I have never seen a Chinese garment factory worker have a baby in my entire 4 years on Saipan.
There are no children in those barracks.
No. Inside that factory, Chinese law applies, and Chinese law is supreme.
Even though it's the United States of America.
Right. The flag doesn't fly inside there.
We saw how it works when we were first on the island in December. Members of the governor's security squad in an unmarked car were assigned to follow our 2020 crew, keeping close tabs on the movements of a 2020 producer who was assigned to make contact with island dissidents.
We're going to be shifting over.
Even federal safety inspectors from the Labor Department's OSHA agency say they have a difficult time when they try to operate on Saipan.
We'll try to track down the employer.
With workers afraid to complain about often dangerous conditions.
We found locked fire exits, the sort of thing that's reminiscent of the Triangle Shirt Factory disaster.
We asked Frank Strassheim, the regional director of OSHA, to look at an undercover tape made for 2020 by a worker inside a Korean-owned factory that does a lot of business with the Gap, a factory that had a serious fire 3 years ago. The tape shows what Strassheim called serious fire hazards, including what appears to be an electric circuit panel that the workers told us was so overheated that fans had been placed in front of it in an apparent effort to try to cool it down.
That's clearly a violation.
What's so dangerous about that kind of thing?
Well, that you can overload your electrical circuits and have a source, it becomes a source of ignition. The building catches on fire.
The Gap, whose on-island buying office is a 5-minute drive away from the factory, said its people had not seen what 2020 found, and that the factory currently meets the Gap Code of Conduct. But this week, OSHA, based on its own follow-up investigation, cited the factory for repeat violations of fire exit requirements and for repeat violations involving toilets which didn't work, something we had also seen on our undercover tape. The factory's attorney told 2020 it is now fixing the problems OSHA found.
I told my members nothing abusive action is allowed.
The president of the Saipan Garment Manufacturers, James Lin, says it's wrong to say all factories on Saipan are bad places to work. and he gave us a tour of the factory he owns, a huge place whose biggest customer is the Gap. This is the factory visitors from the mainland are always taken to, a place that stands out for its cleanliness and adherence to safety rules. But even at this model factory, it was much, much hotter on the factory floor than back in Mr. Lin's air-conditioned office.
Isn't it awfully hot?
No comment.
No comment. Mr. Lin, isn't that a pretty simple question?
It's not hot to me.
It's not hot to you?
Yeah.
You're sweating, I'm sweating.
I'm not.
And what's the moisture?
It's oil. I'm oily face.
And as the tour went on, Lin simply stopped answering some of our questions.
You're the head of the garment manufacturers in Saipan. Some of the women we've talked to here say they have been forced to have abortions to keep their jobs. They live in squalor. There isn't running water. They're cheated regularly on wages. Do you know about those kind of things? Mr. Lin?
The questions angered Lin's business partner,
We're trying to correct things.
including former Saipan Lieutenant Governor Pedro Tenorio.
You know, you want to sensationalize things because
There's no
it
need
sells.
You know what?
It sells.
There really is no need to sensationalize anything because
Well,
the conditions
at-
speak for
okay.
themselves.
But when you go back and report every goddamn thing is bad over here, that's no good. That's not being fair.
But federal safety inspectors say while some factories have improved, the overwhelming picture on Saipan is of an island full of sweatshops.
Many of them are what I would consider sweatshops, yes.
That's not a term that you throw around loosely, I take it.
No, I don't throw it around loosely, but that's indeed the best way to characterize a lot of the things that we've seen.
But Saipan has cultivated some powerful friends back in Washington, spending millions of dollars on lobbyists and free trips in the middle of the winter for members of Congress and their staff. Congressman Tom DeLay of Houston, the third-ranking Republican in the House, went as a guest of the Saipan government over the Christmas holiday, a trip that included a tour of several factories and barracks, with one that even Congressman DeLay had to concede was nothing to write home about.
But you know, this trip has been very beneficial.
Still, at a fancy New Year's Eve dinner thrown in his honor, DeLay praised the outgoing governor and vowed to fight efforts back in Washington to change Saipan's immigration and labor laws.
Because you are a shining light for what is happening in the Republican Party, and you represent everything that is good about what we're trying to do in America, in leading the world in the free market system.
And DeLay is just one of more than 80 influential congressmen and congressional staff members who have been brought out to Saipan. Most put up, as was DeLay, at the beachfront Hyatt Regency, about as far from the island sweatshops as it is possible to get on Saipan.
They're paying your way, so of course you're going to see what they want you to see.
They haven't seen the Saipan you've seen.
You can't see much from the Hyatt.
What the people making big money on the island see are prosperous factories with contented workers making cheap clothes for the American market, something the manufacturers say no one on the mainland has any reason or right to challenge.
What happened to the United States when you first got the colonies established and then bring people in?
This is
Don't you have coolies? Don't you have slaves? Didn't you? This is the American government that brought the slaves in and got the Civil War going, and the Americans killed themselves because of that?
So this is 1998.
No, it doesn't matter.
But what administration officials see on Saipan is a situation so out of hand, so inconsistent with American values, that there's actually talk now of cutting Saipan loose, ending its right to be called American soil.
And if you want to have this kind of economy, fine. You just don't do it with the American flag flying overhead.
Boy, Brian, one would imagine that there's been some reaction from these companies.
We've heard quite a bit, Hugh. The companies that do business there all say they have codes of conduct that they expect the factories to follow. The Liz Claiborne Company said, for instance, they knew about the problems, but they're working with the factories to try to improve them. Others, Polo, Disney, J.C. Penney, said they were completely unaware of what was going on until we told them, and they are now sending executives there to investigate. And in fact, J.C. Penney has announced they will no longer use the Made in the U.S.A. label for clothing made in Saipan.
Where does it stand with regard to a possible change in the law?
Well, there are proposals before Congress, and a Senate hearing is scheduled in 2 weeks to go into these various charges that we have revealed here tonight.
Boy, that's something revealed. Thank you, Brian.